collar is next. This time I've got the pattern out. The collar is fairly straightforward, happily, and it's made from two main pieces. This is the section that folds down, and this, which we'll come to in a moment, is the bit that stands up. So this goes around your neck, and then this piece would go over your tie. The pattern asks us to begin with the bit that goes over your tie. And the first thing that we do is we just put the two pieces facing one another. So I've got the general white fabric of the shirt and then the printed section. But again, because I'm using a calico as an interface, I have another layer of that here. When you stack your fabrics, if you're using a separate interfacing, remember you want your two outer facing fabrics facing one another, and then you want your calico on the outside. That way, when you turn everything out, everything will be as you want it, and your interfacing will go inside. We will sew along this edge, all the way along this edge, and down on this edge. I've disappeared off camera there. Haven't decided if I'm top stitching this yet. It does recommend to do that in the pattern. I would consider that optional. We'll see how this sits when it's done. On the pattern down here, it recommends, once you've sewn all your edges, to just trim off the corners close to the seam. I've not gone quite as close as the diagram, but I'm comfortable with that. I've also trimmed these side seams down just a little bit to even them out. Sometimes as you sew, because this is curved here, you might find a lighter weight fabric sort of stretches out a little bit, and it's because you're effectively just on the bias. What I mean by the bias is you have your threads going one over the other like that, and normally you cut in line with one or the other direction, but if you're on the diagonal and your cut goes through it, the threads, instead of staying locked like that, will sort of do that, and it just pushes it out. It's a very good way of getting a little bit of ease into a garment if you need that, but it can also cause problems that are more complicated than I really should go into in the video here. The other thing that we need to do is we need to clip this curve. That's very easy. You literally just clip into it. Don't go all the way to your stitch line there. You want to just come close to it. And do that all the way along. I'm doing that, what are we looking at? About 2 fingers width between each snip. You don't have to be mathematically precise with this. Because this is a very gentle curve, I'm not going to cut a V. If this was a very steep curve, I would make these into little triangles instead. What this does is allows the fabric to move about and squash and stretch, so it maintains the curve when you turn everything the right way out. If you don't do it, it can end up looking puckered and being very difficult to press flat. Some fabrics are more forgiving than others. Wool is very tolerant of being stretched about. So now we've done all of our clipping, we shall turn this the right way out and just very carefully poke the corners of the collar out. Do take a bit of care on this because the collar on the shirt is one of the most visible parts of it. So you want everything to be as smart and crisp as you can manage. And then will come the challenge of getting the collar points level. That's one of my least favourite jobs on shirts. But we'll see how we do when we get there. Right. The other reason that you want to press it is, can you see how this is looking quite fat on the top and it's trying to roll out flat? The fabric naturally wants to try and find the shortest route, rather like water does. So we need to press it just to make sure that we keep that very gentle curve on the shape of the collar. I shall go and do that, and then we'll decide if we're going to top stitch this or not and move on to the next part. I'm quite happy with this without the top stitching. I think that looks perfectly fine, so I'm going to leave this as is. The nice thing about top stitching is, on the collar and the cuffs at least, I can add that later on if I feel that it's something that I want. So for now, we shan't worry. We're going to move on to doing the neckband. And for this, you have 3 pieces that are all the same. You've got your 2 outer layers, one in printed and one in plain for me, and you have your interfacing layer if you're not using iron-on, as with everything else. This is where the notches on the pattern are actually useful, because they help you line everything up. And on here we have a couple of notches here and a couple of notches here, and these are what we're lining up together, because you take the interface and printed layer and then line up the notches as best you can, and we'll be sewing this edge onto here and sandwiching it with that piece. So when you turn this all the right way out, that becomes your collar. I think this is another one of those that's going to be a little bit easier for me to construct and then show you once it's constructed than to try and show you on the desk here, so that's what I shall do. That's now all sewn together, and when you sew this, you're not just catching the collar that's in here, you're also going right to the end and coming off, and this gives you a completed collar. There's a few more jobs to do here before we turn it the right side out. The first thing we need to do is grade this seam, which we did do in an earlier video, and that's where you cut back each layer a little bit less, so your final layer you cut back is almost the full piece, and then your first one is a very small amount. We'll then need to clip all of the curve on here, and then we can turn it out and press it. I'm going to grade it from the interfacing side, because on this side the layers haven't lined up quite as well. That does happen sometimes. So you start off cutting fairly close to your stitch line. Trying just to cut through one layer at a time. Just going to move that pattern out of the way, it's making everything slide off my table. And now you can see that the next layer, this one here, this one needs taking about the same amount as the interfacing because they're effectively the same layer, and then we'll trim that one back a bit further, and then this is your final one which we won't trim at all. What this does is when you turn the piece the right way out, it gives you a much flatter seam. The fabric has the space it needs to go into, which is especially important on a bulky part of your garment like this, because you don't want the collar to be too thick and uncomfortable. You want it to be as nice and smooth as you can make it, so that it looks the best and it feels comfortable when you're wearing it. It's a little bit tricky doing this, because you really don't want to cut through the wrong piece. Actually, looking at the layers of my fabric here, I think it's already sort of graded itself. this is a really good example point of it. You can see the interfacing and the printed layer there, then the collar itself with its layers, and then you've got the other side of this piece here, which is full length. So I'm going to leave that at that. As long as your grading is sort of like a little fabric terrace and it's fairly even, you're okay. Next thing to do, because these are quite defined curves, you do need to notch those, and I am going to use a little V notch on these because it's got to squash a lot more fabric into the space. You should only need a couple, and then we'll just put a few along the collar line. This will also help it curve around your neck a bit easier, because there's a lot of complicated shapes going on where your shoulders meet your neck, and you want your fabric to conform as well as possible. Good strong scissors for this are quite important. So invest in the best shears you can afford. With that done, you can then turn everything the right way out. And you can see how when you pull on the collar here, the curve defines itself, which is really good. There's very little work to push that out, which is what you want. Most importantly, I did check this before I started snipping, you want to make sure that your collars are about the same length, because that's going to make the next stage a lot easier. If you find that there's quite a lot of difference in height here, I just moved that back. You see how these are all nice and even here. If you find that maybe your collar points are sitting like that, check this before you do any cutting, obviously, but it means that you need to just unpick one of your seams and either drop or raise the fabric. It's very much a sort of experience thing. The more you do, the better you'll get at it, and even I'm not that great at doing collars sometimes. Let's give this a press and then it's ready to go on the shirt. The collar is now sewn together and ready to go on the shirt. Originally, I wasn't going to put French cuffs on this shirt, so this was going to be the side that you saw when the collar was folded down. However, because of my little mistake, this printed side will be the hidden side and the white side will be the visible side. That's okay though, because I mean, sometimes I do wear my collar like this because I'm one of those people, and that will look quite nice on the back because the pattern will carry on up the back, and that will be a nice detail. So let's pretend we did that on purpose. You can do that a lot with sewing. On the collar there are these little notches, and there's the same on the body here, and that's what we're going to line up. So you want to pin everything around and shuffle it. Now on this seam you might find it is easier for you to baste it rather than pin it, because it's a very complicated shape and it can just help give it a bit of flexibility to hold it in place before you do it on the machine. I'm going to put all this together and sew it. It's the same process as with everything else, and I shall bring you back when we're ready for the final stage on this. Once we've got the collar attached on the machine, there's a little bit of hand sewing to do there, and then there's just one more bit of machine sewing to do before its final finishing details. The collar is all together. This is the back of the shirt, and all pressed, looking really nice. I've just got the collar stood up here just to show you how the construction is on this. For the inside of the collar, I've already pressed this piece under because this will need to be hand sewn. I'm not top stitching it. And you can see on the inside here that your material presses up into the collar stand rather than down into the body, because that bit will come down to your stitch line and then we'll hand sew that shut. If you prefer to top stitch, then absolutely do, that's not a problem. I'm very happy with how this is looking so far. Let's just turn this down. Now obviously we have no buttons on yet. So things don't sit perfect, but once everything is actually stitched together inside, this is pretty much how the collar ends up sitting on it. It's quite a wide collar, but because of the nature of this shirt, I probably won't ever wear it with a tie. It's more a sort of wear it on its own thing. The last bit of machine sewing left is just to turn this bottom hem. The way that we do that is you take the fabric, you turn it, and you turn it again, and then you top stitch it. The thing that makes it tricky is the bottom of the shirt is a funny shape. The bottom of this shirt, like many modern shirts, isn't a straight cut along the bottom. It's actually got a shape, so there's less fabric over your hips at the side and more front and back. All it means is when you turn this seam on the bottom, it's going to want to wrinkle on you as you go around. There's not a lot you can do about it, unfortunately. When it comes to doing the hem on the shirt, this is our last piece of machine sewing, you are going to do a rolled hem, which is a very simple thing, but it's made complicated by the fact that the hem on this shirt is shaped. I've already gone halfway round, so I have most of it pinned. And what you want to do is you take the fabric and you just fold it and then fold it again. It's called a rolled hem because you're basically rolling the hem up. Now there are special machine foots that you can buy that specifically roll and sew the hem, but they do it in a slightly different way. You'll find that used on things like handkerchiefs. And you can do it by hand. But this is the way this is done. And you work your way around until you've got it all done. The problem you'll find is as you get round the curves, as we've got here, we're just entering into a curve, you'll fold and fold and it'll want to twist like that. So you sort of have to go a little back and forth and just shuffle and roll and repin, and you'll get the hang of it as you go, but it's very much a thing you learn by doing. I can't really show you how to do it, so play with some fabric, cut some wiggly lines on it, and if you're not too confident doing it on the shirt, do it with some scraps first, and once you're confident, then do it on the shirt. If you have an overlocker, you can cheat. Just overlock the entire edge and leave it. If you're always going to tuck the shirt in, nobody will ever see it. It'll be our little secret. I've now finished pinning the entire hem and I'm ready to sew it on the machine. If you prefer, you can hand sew this seam. Just a simple whip stitch will do just fine. I don't want to. This is a seam that's never seen because I always tuck my shirts in, so I'd just rather do it on the machine, it's quicker. You want to go to the edge that's nearest the body of the shirt rather than the bottom of the shirt, because like when you do your French seams, this will catch the raw edges completely. If you go too far down towards the bottom of the shirt, this can unravel a bit. Go as close to the edge as you can and just keep a little bit of tension with your hand on this section. Two reasons. One is it will help keep everything inside so it won't unravel on you, and the other is because this is curved, you're making use of that bias cut that I mentioned earlier, because it's going to just stretch a tiny bit and just help all the material ease in without wrinkling or puckering on you. Just go at a speed that's comfortable for you. You've got all the time in the world for this. Now, I'm coming up to a section where this curve gets a bit tighter and it is trying to wrinkle on me. So I just slow down Keep a bit of tension on that curve. And it stayed nice and flat. We're on the home straight now. Just make sure when you finish that you go over where you started with your stitching, and that will just help keep everything secure. That will now just need a press to make sure it's okay. At the moment you can just about make out it's a little bit wrinkly, and that's just because it's a curved piece and you've had to fold and fold. Once that's pressed, that usually disappears. But again, doesn't matter, this bit is usually tucked into your clothes anyway, so nobody ever sees it. That marks the end of the machine sewing on this now. Just the hand sewing to go. I'm quite pleased with how this has turned out. Only fly in the ointment is just this little detail here, but nobody's perfect. On the hem, you can see in certain lights there's a little bit of a wrinkle. If you look at a shop bought shirt, you'll very often see the same thing on their seams. That's just the nature of fabric. On the back, you can see that my stitch line has wandered a little bit in places, but the only person who's going to see that is you at the moment and me, so that's not really a concern. This is how the French cuffs end up looking, and I'll put some buttonholes in here for some cufflinks, and I think that looks quite nice actually. The really nice thing about the French cuffs is it does match the collar quite well, and because these have got the print on the inside, if I just wear these cuffs loose and maybe stand up the collar, again, it all matches. I've not finished pressing the collar yet because I've got to sew the inside of it, so it's not quite sitting as it should do at the moment, but other than that, all of the back has also turned out really nicely. I'll do the hand sewing and then we'll do the final reveal.